All right. Good evening, everyone. Good to be with you on another Wednesday night here for our youth midweek Bible study thing, whatever you want to call it, our Wednesday night extravaganza or whatever word you feel like is fitting for this. Good to have you guys all here and everything, and hope you guys are doing well. Hopefully, this past week has been good for you guys and be able to enjoy your summer, even if it is still kind of like in quarantine and different restrictions and all that. So, but hopefully you've still been able to enjoy that time, enjoy your time with the Lord and all of those different things going on right now. Maybe time with family, 4th of July, right? Like was this weekend. Hopefully you had a good time with that. Watching maybe some fireworks. Let's see. My connection is unstable. Hopefully I'm not frozen too much. Okay. I think we're good again. All right. So as we take a couple minutes to let people kind of join in here and everything, just a reminder of a couple things, kind of the same announcements we did last week, but just in case people weren't here for that, I'll keep announcing just to make sure people hear this of just the fact that due to COVID-19 and the restrictions and all that, like summer camps are actually canceled and everything, and we're not going to be able to do that after all and everything, unfortunately. So we are brainstorming different things of maybe we can try to do something in the fall or spring or something to kind of try to make up for that. But it kind of just depends on where we're at with restrictions and all that. So stay tuned for further announcements with that. Coming up here in the next months. So it probably won't be like in the next couple weeks or something, in the next few months or something like that. We'll have hopefully some more details with that. Stuff with our restrictions of when we can meet and all that. I'm sure you guys are all still curious. I'm still curious of when that's actually going to be. We still don't know. It just depends on when the government lifts some of the restrictions. All right. So that's kind of where we're at this point, unfortunately. But as soon as we kind of have a green light to kind of get together and do stuff, you can bet we're gonna be doing that. So it'll be fun to get back with you guys and have some sort of normal nights here. Yeah, it's still super weird where we're in the middle of summer and not seeing all you guys and being able to do all the different stuff, whether it's camps or soccer camp or just pool parties, whatever it is. And so hopefully we'll be able to do something before I don't think I posted the notes in the description. I was about to say you can look at your notes and all that, but I don't think I posted that. So let me get that here and I'll post it in the comments. All right. So you have in the comments, you have the notes. Okay. So again, let's see, let's get started here. Okay. So again, just we wrapped up our series on not wasting your quarantine last week, right? We had our kind of 5-part series that we did, and hopefully that was beneficial and helpful for you guys as we kind of went through that. And again, like a lot of those principles that we talked about were applicable not just for your time in quarantine, but really like every stage of life, right? That if you really want to get to the end of your life and not feel like you wasted your life, right? Like that you look back on it and feel like, man, I just wasted however many years, right? Like those are the things that you should focus on, right? Like, and so again, if you need that reminder, you can go back, rewatch those. I'll be uploading those soon to the website. I've been a little behind on that, but we'll have those uploaded soon that you guys can watch, or they're on our YouTube channel. You can watch them on here as well. If you need a refresher or if you missed any and all that. But hopefully, again, that was, something that was very applicable for you guys as you just consider, again, you're in the stage where you're kind of stuck at home a lot. You're kind of just here. And so, like, make the most of it, right? Like, don't waste that time just sitting around doing nothing, right? But hopefully you can really persevere and fight through and really want to make the most of that time, right? And so hopefully these past couple of weeks you've been really focused on that, of really, like we talked about last week, having that eternal mindset, right? Like how can I be living in light of eternity, right? Like doing things that are going to be of eternal value, not just things that are like beneficial for right now, right? Like, and so hopefully you've been able to grow in that this past week and be able to focus on that and have that mindset as you're, again, going through this quarantine, going through the stage of life, right? All right. So tonight, though, what we're doing is, since we wrapped up our series, we're transitioning to the next book we're going to be studying. Okay. And really, I really was kind of hoping that we would be back in person by the time we kind of started this. But as you can see, we're not. But that's all right. And so, but we're going to be going through the book of Matthew. Okay. We're going through the Gospel of Matthew. That's the next book we'll be going through, and we'll be kind of here for a while, as you can imagine. I think it took us 2 years for Romans. Yeah, 2 years for Romans. And so Matthew, a little bit longer, all that. So probably been here for at least a year, probably more like 2. I don't know, I haven't really fully planned it out yet, but I mean, we'll probably go through it faster than parts of Romans, but it's still long. So probably a couple years here where we're going to be studying really the life of Christ, right? And as told by Matthew. And so that's what our focus is going to be here in this book. And I'm really excited to go through it. It is really cool, like being able to kind of choose what I'm teaching and going through different books and all that. Because like I got to choose a lot of like my favorites too. And Matthew is definitely up there on my list of favorite books of the Bible. And I'm sure you'll get a glimpse into why that is as we go through this a little bit here. But I'm just excited, right? And I think really just excited to really dive into like the life of Christ with all you guys and really be able to examine what his life was like, what he did, what he talked about, like all these different things that I'm sure maybe you've heard many of those things before, but to really dive deep into what's going on in the Gospels, right? And I think, and hopefully through this time, you'll be able to pick up and see just the glory that is Christ and his life and how glorious and beautiful it truly was. And so that's kind of the goal for this book, all right, is to really dive into the life of Christ, right? And really, like, who better to study, right, than Christ himself? We're called to imitate Christ. We're called to live like him, right? And so we need to study what he was like, right? We need to study his life, and that's what we get to see here in the book of Matthew. And so definitely really excited to go through with you guys, and hopefully you're excited as well as we go through this, okay? And so tonight, as the title of this video, as well as if you open up the handout, again, it's over there in the comments, okay? You have a link there to the handout. As that says, right, we're just kind of doing an introduction tonight. We're not going, actually not really even getting into the book itself at this point. Just more of an introduction where I want to get us kind of like ready to go, hit the ground running next week as we dive into this in more detail. But I wanted to get us kind of introduced to what is this book, right? Like, and again, because as we talked about, like when we talked about studying the Bible, right? Like everything has like kind of a context. Everything has something like kind of around it, right? Like no verse is an island and no book is an island, right? Where you just take it in isolation of everything else. And so I want to get us kind of caught up to speed where we're at, like in the Bible, in biblical history and all that, so that as we approach Matthew, we're like all on the same page. We're all like ready to go. Okay. And so that's really the goal of tonight, is to kind of get through more of this kind of background stuff. And even in that, like hopefully this will still be encouraging. And I know some of this can be a little more just kind of technical or different facts and different things, but hopefully we can fight through that to realize like this isn't just for head knowledge, but hopefully for one, preparing us to study the word so we handle it well and accurately. But then can also be even somewhat applicable with some of the things we're going to talk about, okay? Cool. So that's where we're heading. So first thing, if you have your handout that we're going to talk about, is the author, all right? The author of the Gospel of Matthew. And I'm sure if I would ask many of you of who the author is, maybe you would just have this guess of Matthew. And you would be right? Like, and really, like, there's no explicit like indication in the text itself, right? Like, I mean, like Romans and different letters of Paul make it really easy because it's like I, Paul, am writing to you, right? Like it makes it really easy of like who's writing, who's the author. But this book, right? Like there's no like I, Matthew, am writing this, right? Like there's no mention of Matthew exactly, right? However, right, like pretty early on, like in the first couple centuries, right, like after this book was written, there's a lot of kind of historical evidence of people attributing this to Matthew, like the disciple of Jesus. Okay. And really, if you read through it, right, like a lot of the things kind of make sense, right, in this book. Because if you remember, right, Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, also called Levi by some of the other gospel writers, right? You guys remember his profession? He was a tax collector, right? No, you guys all got that, right? He's a tax collector, okay? And kind of with that, one of the things you see like in Matthew, like he is a little more technical when talking about like money and different things, okay? Like he uses proper names for certain coins and all that, which like that's weird. Yeah, but like he's like a tax collector, so it makes sense, right? And then just some other things like the way he talks about himself in this gospel compared to how other people talk about him kind of make it seem like, yeah, Matthew's most likely the writer here, okay? And so that's what's happening. So Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, right? One of those who are called to be one of the 12, right? Like that's who is writing this gospel account. So you have someone who is an eyewitness, right? Like someone who, and that's really awesome. Okay. And so, like I said, Matthew, like he's a tax collector. And if you know, like back then, especially like tax collectors were not viewed favorably, right? Like, especially like in Israel, they're really like hated in Israel because they're essentially viewed as like, hey, you work for like the Romans, right? Like the government who's occupying us right now. And a lot of times, like the tax collectors, not only was it they were working for like a foreign like government that was like oppressing these people, right? But also a lot of the tax collectors were like corrupt, right? That they would actually take more money from people because they understood like, hey, like I'm going to pay the government what they want, but I'm going to take a little extra on the side, right? Because I have the whole authority of Rome kind of behind me, all this military and stuff. So people are going to do what I say kind of a thing. And they kind of abuse that power. And so they were really not liked in Israel. But we see that even though like Matthew probably was one that was, like kind of on the outskirts of society in a sense, right? They're not included a lot because people didn't like him, right? But you have him respond, right? When Jesus calls him to be part of his disciples, he gets up and joins, right? He joins this. And again, you get to see like someone who's looked down on by society, that Jesus calling him to be part of his kind of inner circle, right? Like his disciples. And that's really cool because I mean, that's just the reality of what Jesus does and really the reality of the gospel that is calling those who are even low in society's eyes and different things. That's who God calls to be part of his own, like to be part of his people. And that's an amazing thing. And even just looking at his disciples, right? Jesus' disciples, you have such a wide variety, and we're going to see a little bit of that later as well. But you have this wide variety, starting with even just Matthew, this tax collector, who you wouldn't expect to be like, oh, if you had to choose like the A team of people to join your team, especially in Israel, you probably wouldn't choose like a tax collector, right? And so, again, you see Jesus' grace and mercy there, and including Matthew and calling him to be one of his disciples. All right. All right. So that's the author. Okay. That's Matthew. Next thing, audience, right? Important to understand one, who's writing, as well as kind of who they're writing to. And again, we don't have an explicit thing of Matthew saying, I'm writing to these people, right? And so we just kind of infer a little bit by what he talks about in the book and everything, and of who he's kind of writing to. And really, like, just more generally, vaguely, we take it that he is writing to a Jewish audience, a primarily Jewish audience, okay? Because of, like, this kind of implied and seen by his focus on really wanting to present Jesus as, like, the Messiah, right? The King of Israel and all that, okay? And that was predicted in the Old Testament. And you see this, like he quotes many passages from the Old Testament, he's always referring back to that, saying like, hey, this Jesus is doing this to fulfill something in the Old Testament, right? He's fulfilling this passage. He keeps mentioning the Old Testament. And then also you have times where like when certain Jewish traditions or customs happen, like Matthew doesn't really explain them that much compared to like the other gospel writers. They kind of explain like that custom or tradition, right? But Matthew doesn't, because he's probably writing to a Jewish audience who would understand these customs, these traditions. That's why he doesn't explain them, right? They would know it. Okay, they're familiar with it. And so kind of all of that makes it pretty likely that he's writing primarily to a Jewish audience, okay? People who are familiar with like the Old Testament, okay? Familiar with kind of that background, okay? And that's really who he's writing to. All right. Next, we have the date, which again, that's kind of hard to be precise about, okay? But normally people kind of attribute it somewhere in like the 50s to 60s AD, somewhere in there, okay? Like after Jesus' life, after his death, and which is like an 80-30 around there. And then before like the temple is destroyed in 70 AD. So they normally fit it somewhere kind of in there, and most people take it sometime in the 50s or 60s AD. So about 20 to 30 years after the death of Jesus, okay? After Jesus' death and resurrection. That's when Matthew is writing this, okay? I was about to say Paul. I've been saying Paul so often with Romans. It's Matthew now. We're talking about Matthew. Okay. So 50s, 60s, somewhere in there, okay? Next thing, purpose. Kind of like, why is he writing, right? Why is he writing this? And really, like, one, it's to present kind of the life of Jesus, okay? But he does so, like, he presents Jesus as really that long-awaited Messiah, that King of Israel, okay? Like, as we kind of mentioned. And this, kind of the purpose behind that would, again, if he's writing to a Jewish audience, can be kind of twofold a little bit, right? Like, where you have on one side, it can be very evangelistic, where this could be to really be written to like non-believing Jews in order to, hey, show them, hey, this is your Messiah, right? Like, look at all this evidence. Look at all of this that shows that Jesus is that Messiah, that he really is the King of Israel, right? Like, this is the one you want to put your faith in and believe, right? Like, and turn to. So it could be very evangelistic. It could also just serve to like encourage and instruct believers as well, right? In the reality of who Jesus is, kind of like what we're doing now, where we get to see this glimpse of, Jesus is that Messiah. He is that King, okay? And we get to see that as well, okay? And so, again, like, he's really going to point to this fact that Jesus is the one that the Old Testament is pointing to, right? That this Messiah that was predicted so long ago, this is him, this is it, right? This is the moment, this is the one, okay? And he's going to show that. And again, you see that throughout all these quotes of the Old Testament, always pointing back. And really then, the reality is, like, if you, okay, let's see, am I frozen? I don't know why my internet's so bad. Okay, but like, I love the Old Testament, and that's one of the reasons why, okay, is because of this reality of, like, when you study the Old Testament, you get to see more in depth of all that, then you understand more fully what's happening in the New Testament, especially in the life of Christ, right? Especially in the life of Christ, that the reality is, like, there aren't like accidents in Jesus' life, right? Like, he's very purposeful in all that he does. And that's what, like, Matthew will pick up. He's like, hey, Jesus is doing this because it's fulfilling this, right? And he did this because it's fulfilling that verse, right? Like, and there's all this. And so the more you grasp and understand the Old Testament, the more glorious you see Jesus in the Gospels in the New Testament, right? Like, and so just again, this little side note, study the Old Testament, right? Familiarize yourself with the Old Testament. I know sometimes it's hard, it's unfamiliar, right? But it's so worth it. It's so good, right? And so don't avoid it, right? Like, try to study it, try to learn it. And I think it will benefit not only your understanding of God and who he is, but also your understanding of Jesus in the New Testament and all that's going on, okay? All right. So that's kind of his purpose in writing, right? And so tying into that then is the theme. And so this will be that theme that I'll be asking you guys every week for about a couple years, and hopefully it gets ingrained in your mind, right? Like, we had last couple of years with Romans, it was the gospel and God's plan, right? And now we're looking at this new theme, right? Which is what? It's Jesus, the King and Messiah. Okay, Jesus, the King and Messiah. Okay, and so really you have to understand that like each of the gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, those 4 gospels, you can wonder like, why do we need 4 gospels to talk about Jesus' life? Well, the reason why is because each of these gospels have a different focus, right? They have a different perspective on the life of Christ, right? And so essentially they're viewing Christ from different angles, right? Is kind of what you can say. For example, like Mark focuses on Jesus as the servant, right? And even like maybe like the suffering servant. Luke is Jesus as a man and like the perfect human. Okay, he's really emphasizing that. And John is really like Jesus as God, right? He is the Son of God, and so all of them have these different focuses. And then Matthew, you have this focus on him portraying and showing that Jesus is the true King and Messiah of Israel. Okay, that's his focus. That's what he's going to be driving at. Is continually turning and showing, hey, this is the true King, this is the Messiah, right? And both of those kind of go together. The Messiah, right? If you're like, what's the Messiah? That's the one like in the Old Testament that was talked about all the way back in like Genesis 3:15, like the one that you see is supposed to come and redeem God's people, to bring salvation to people, right? That's this Messiah, okay? And these two, like the fact that he's King and Messiah, I mean, in order to be the Messiah, you would be a king, right? That's kind of like how it is. Those are like linked together. But I wanted to keep them kind of separate just so we get this in our mind that there is this element of kingship and the focus on Christ as king, that he is the true King of Israel, right? But it's also really focused on displaying him as the Messiah, right? That he is this one that the Old Testament was always pointing to, the long-awaited one. This is him, okay? He is the rightful King of Israel. He is the Messiah, right? That's what Matthew's focus is. And we're going to point that out as we go along, right? We're going to see that time and time again, right? You even see that right off the bat in chapter 1. You have a genealogy tracing Jesus back to David, okay, who was a king of Israel. Okay, so you see that right away. Matthew trying to get this focus, okay? And so that's the theme, Jesus, the King and Messiah. Okay, that's this theme. That's what we're going to keep repeating until it's ingrained in your mind, until you can just, someone calls you up in the middle of the night, asks you, what's the theme of Matthew? You can say it, Jesus, the King and Messiah, right? Without even having to think. You got this nailed down, okay? That's the theme. All right. And so then the last thing I wanted to do here is to kind of run through a little bit of the historical context, okay? Meaning, like, what's going on kind of like in history at this point, like when Matthew's writing this book, and like where does this fit into like the rest of the Bible, okay? And I think this is so important because, again, we can just dive into a passage, we can start in a book without any real basis of where we at in biblical history, right? And I think a lot of times we don't have this full understanding of like, when is this taking place, right? We can kind of just think in our mind, we like have these brief thoughts back from like Sunday school where we're like, okay, I mean, like Adam and Eve, I know them. And I think after them, like you have this guy like Abraham or something. And then I know David comes. And then I think you have Jesus, right? Like that's kind of like it. And like we can kind of assume like these things just kind of happen. And maybe there's a little bit of time in between. But like it's good to see kind of the buildup of how we got to where we're at. Okay. And because even, right, like even if you're just reading through the Old Testament too, and we're going to talk about this, right? Like the Old Testament kind of ends with like, hey, like Persia's like the main world power, right? They're kind of the one conquering and doing stuff. But then the New Testament opens with Rome suddenly in power. And they're like, Rome, where did they come from? How did that happen? And so that's what we want to talk about. That's what we want to get kind of a glimpse into, is where we're at. And so in the notes, okay, you have kind of a list of things, and we're just going to walk very quickly, just give this overview of kind of the Old Testament up until this point, and even like the time in between Old and New Testament, to give you a glimpse of how we're at where we're at, okay? And so, right, like, again, you know, from time in Sunday school, you have like creation, all that, Genesis 1, Adam and Eve, okay, beginning. And you have kind of this narrowing effect, right, of God's people and everything through each birth and all that. Next kind of big player you have is Abraham. Okay, Genesis 12, that like God's going to bless the nations through his family, right? Like through his descendants, right? Like is going to bring blessing to the whole world, right? And you have some dates there on your sheet because again, I want to give you a picture of like what's happening. And so you have Abraham who lived in 2166 through 1991 BC, right? Like long time ago, right? Like 4,000 years ago, right? And so he lived that time. You have his son Isaac, right? Who Israel, like you have Jacob, who's Israel. Sorry, I don't know if I'm frozen or not. When I have a thing that pops up that says my internet is unstable and all that, so I don't know if I'm like frozen or not during that time. But anyway, so you have Jacob, Israel, right? He had one of his sons, Joseph, right? Remember that whole thing with Egypt? They go down to Egypt because of famine, all that. They end up being there for like over 400 years. And during that time, they end up being taken as slaves, right, of Egypt and being oppressed in that way. But then 1446 BC, right, the Exodus happens, right? And if you've seen some of these lessons on Sundays, Spencer's going through the book of Exodus, right? And the event of the Exodus, so important in Israel's history, right? That happens. Then they kind of wander in the wilderness for 40 years because of their disobedience, right? They couldn't enter the promised land right away because the people were disobedient. So they wander around 40 years. And then the conquest happens, right? Joshua, remember Jericho, shout, walls fall down, all that stuff, right? That happens, okay? They spend quite a bit of time conquering the land, doing all that. After Joshua and that time, then you have the time of the judges, okay? Which is not a great time in Israel's history, right? They're still trying to kind of fully conquer the land. But again, they're not because they're not fully obedient, right? They're disobedient. So God sends nations to kind of like take parts of the nation over, right? To kind of rebuke them for their sin in a sense. And then people cry out, God, help us. God sends a judge, someone to come help them, deliver them, and all that. And it's kind of this whole cycle that happens for, as you can see on the handout, if you have that open, like almost 300 years, like 270 years, okay, of that. Until a little bit later, you have kind of a monarchy, you have a king, okay? You have a kingship begin, okay? But it begins with Saul, okay, if you remember him. What's that, in 1051 BC? Okay, that's kind of when the monarchy starts, okay? Israel now has a king, and that's all happening. But then after Saul, now you have David, right? This is where you have David, where he lived from 1041 to 971 BC, okay? So about over 1,000 years after, or about 1,000 years like after the time of Abraham, okay? So we can often think like, yeah, Abraham, then like David, right? Like it's like, no, like you have Abraham, then like 1,000 years go by, a long time, and then you have David, okay? King David, very important figure in Israel's history, and is going to be a very important figure in the book of Matthew, okay? Where part of Jesus getting shown here is he's like the new David, right? He's the son of David, this Messiah who is to come, okay? All right. And so then after David, you have who? Solomon, okay? His son Solomon, remember him? During his reign, the temple's built, right? Like a lot of prosperity and peace happening through that time, but also kind of a lot of wickedness, right, going on. And then after him, with his son Rehoboam taking over, you have the nation split, right? The nation of Israel divides, right? That's where, if you're, again, following along the notes, you have the divided monarchy, right? Where now the nation is split into two, where in the north you have Israel, and in the south you have Judah, okay? These two nations that kind of form, okay? And again, not a great time period. The northern kingdom is pretty much just bad all the time, okay? And they eventually just get taken into exile, right? Like by Assyria. God sends Assyria in to essentially wipe them out, remove them from the land. That happens in 722 BC. Okay, so about 300 years after the time of David. Okay, so a lot of kings have happened since then. Okay, and they get taken out. Huge deal, big deal. Don't have time to go into all that, right? But then about, 140 years later-ish, sort of, you have the southern kingdom, right? Like they have, like Judah, they have some good kings and good times, but a lot of bad as well. And eventually it slowly just declines until finally God brings judgment on them as well. They are removed from the land. They're taken into exile by Babylon, okay? Nebuchadnezzar, right? Maybe that's a familiar name to some of you guys. Takes them into exile in 586 BC. Okay? I know we're blowing through this, right? Like we've already covered 1,500 years of history, okay? So I know I'm going fast, but I just want to give you an overview, okay? After that, right, like they're in Babylon for a while. For 70 years, they're in exile in Babylon, okay, taken away from their land. Again, that's got to be so disheartening and everything, right? But hopefully they're learning from that. After 70 years, they return from exile and they start to rebuild. Okay, they start to rebuild. And that's where you have like guys like Nehemiah and Ezra happening. And you have prophets like Zechariah, Haggai, Malachi, like all these guys. That's when that's happening, okay? Is after the exile, they've returned to land. God has been faithful to bring them back, right? They're back in the land, and they're starting to rebuild the temple, starting to do all these things, okay? And this is where like the Old Testament starts to end, okay? And then really it ends with like Malachi. Malachi is like this last prophet, okay? That the last kind of voice of the prophets here, kind of in like middle of the 400s BC, somewhere in there, is when Malachi was kind of prophesying and ministering. And so really that's kind of this last prophet you have around that time. And then that's where it kind of ends, okay? The Old Testament kind of ends there. And even like in our Bibles, right, like if you kind of the order of the books, Malachi is that last one, right? And now normally, right, like, I mean, if in your Bibles, maybe it's different, but like in my Bible, I think I have like a page in between like Malachi, and then it's like a blank page, and then like the New Testament and Matthew starts, right? Like with like the birth of Jesus and the birth of John the Baptist and all that, right? A lot of time. It's actually 400 years. Okay, so that one like blank page in your Bible, right? That's like 400 years. Okay, and this is this period in between the Old and New Testament. It's called the intertestamental period. Okay, kind of a big word. Okay, intertestamental period. Okay, and it's again 400 years, and these 400 years are called the 400 years of silence. Okay, and the reason for that is because during this time there's no prophets, right? Like again, like I kind of mentioned, like Malachi is kind of this last prophet of the Old Testament. After his ministry, you have nothing for 400 years. Okay, which you got to understand kind of like how hard and painful that would be for a nation that continually had God sending prophets to the nation for thousands of years, right? To then suddenly now, like 400 years, nothing, right? And to again put that in perspective of 400 years, one, to understand like how long that actually is in between the Old and New Testament, and also like kind of that pain, is if you think of just our history 400 years ago, do you know what was happening 400 years ago in our history of America? The Pilgrims were like landing in America. Okay, like the Pilgrims were, I think they actually landed, I think I Googled it, I don't know if my information's right. I think they landed on Plymouth Rock like in 1620. Okay, which was literally 400 years ago, okay, from this year, okay? And so, and you think of all that's changed from then until now. That's a lot, okay? And that's how much time has gone on between the Old and the New Testament, okay? From where Malachi stops to where like the gospel writers and New Testament writers pick up, okay? 400 years, okay? And again, through all that time, like God was silent with the people, right? Like they didn't have these prophets. And as we'll see in a second, like they were oppressed by various nations, all these things. It was a hard time, okay, in their history. And so, as I mentioned before, Old Testament, you end with like Persia kind of in control, all these things. And then New Testament, you have like Rome suddenly empowered, coming out of nowhere, it seems, right? And so the question is like, well, how did that happen? How do we get there? And so that's what I want to talk about real quick, okay, as well. So again, if you have the notes open, you see from like 331 BC through 143 BC, you have kind of Greek rule, okay, that after the Persians, right, like you have this guy, Alexander the Great, I'm sure you've heard of him, from Greece, right, like leading the Greek kingdom, right, like he comes through, conquers a bunch, right, takes over Persia, does all that, right, expands their empire so much, okay, but then he dies early, right, or dies kind of young, and all that, and the kingdom is divided, right? It's divided among his 4 generals, I believe it is, okay, and for Israel's significance, right, they were under the, what's called like the general Ptolemy, right, like, so they were under the Ptolemies, they're in their kind of, that division was theirs, okay, but Israel's kind of position in the world and all that, like geographical position, okay, puts them at an advantageous spot for the world. And so they were actually kind of like in kind of a buffer area or in between the territory of the Ptolemies as well as the Seleucids, okay, and another division of the Greeks, okay. And so those two people kind of battle a lot over Israel and all this, and eventually the Seleucids took over Israel, right? So during the Ptolemies, the Jews had a lot of like freedom. Things were pretty good for the most part. I mean, not great, but not terrible. But then under the Seleucids, it was very bad, right? Like the Seleucids were very much on the side of trying to push Greek culture on them to where they did not allow the Jews to do their Jewish practices and different things. They would actually kill people if they did, right? And you even have one king of the Seleucids, right? And Antiochus Epiphanes or Epiphany, like the 4th or something like that. He even like comes and sacrifices a pig on the altar of the temple, right? Like terrible things, okay, and all that that they're encountering. And so they have this situation for a while till it gets to a point where Israel kind of revolts, okay? You have, again, next thing in your handout there, the Maccabean or Hasmonean rule. Okay, you have like this family of the Maccabees that come and kind of lead a revolt against the Greek government over them. And it takes a while, but eventually they get out from under Greek rule. They're kind of their own thing. These Israelites, this family called the Hasmonean, right? They established this dynasty, the Hasmonean dynasty, okay, of some of the Jews there. And they reigned for about like 80 years, okay? So they actually have this time. But during this time, the Hasmoneans not only took over kind of kingship, but they also took over like the position of high priest. And really, like these people had no claim to the kingship or to the priesthood, actually. Okay. And so I think people realize that it's like, hey, like according to like scripture, you're not supposed to be king and you're not supposed to be priest, but you're both, right? And that wasn't good. And more they became more kind of corrupt, the Hasmonean rulers, and eventually became much more embracing of Greek culture, which was kind of what they resisted to begin with, but they're now embracing it. And so people there begins more turmoil, inner turmoil among the nation because of all of that, until the point where kind of unrest grows until essentially Rome comes in and who was Herod Invader, who was the father of Herod the Great. Herod the Great's the one that you see like in the birth of Jesus, that Herod, okay, probably the main Herod we know, okay. And that whole family that Rome put in charge, the Herods, okay, they were Idumeans, okay, which like what is that? There were people who were kind of part of Israel at some point, but they're descendants of Edom, okay, which if, again, this is where your knowledge of Old Testament helps, which, do you know Edom, who's like the founding father of Edom? Esau, okay, as in like Jacob and Esau. Remember those twins? Jacob is the one whose name is changed to Israel. who Israel's descended from. Esau, Edom descends from him, right? Do you remember, did they have a great relationship? No, right? Edom, Esau did not like Jacob, kind of stole the birthright, did all this stuff, right? And then those two nations never liked each other. And so then if you think about it, Rome's putting someone of Edomite, descendant of Edomite, right? Like in charge of Israel. Is that like a good thing? No, right? Not a smart choice either. Okay. But that picks us up. That takes us all the way to where we are in the New Testament. Okay. So you have Herod the Great. He's in control, right? He's reigning in Israel and Jerusalem as kind of put there by the Roman government. Okay. He has the backing of the Roman government. And that's where we're at in leading up to the Gospels. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. I know that was a lot, just kind of fire hose there of a bunch of stuff, but that gives you at least some basic idea, right, of how we got to where we're at. Okay. What's going on in biblical history, how we got there. Okay. And everything with that. Okay. Make sense? All right, cool. I just like to assume that you're all like, yeah, it makes sense, because I can't see any of you guys, but hopefully it really does. Okay. All right. And then lastly, what I want to just, again, also very briefly talk about, again, if you have your notes, is I kind of want to bring up kind of under the historical context, the people, right? Like the people we're going to kind of encounter in the Gospel of Matthew, just to give you kind of a basis of kind of a foundation of for that when we encounter various groups of people and the names kind of thrown out there. This will hopefully help give you some kind of basis at the beginning here, and I'll explain as we go as well. But yeah, just so you know, right? So people, so you have the Sadducees. Okay, they're mentioned a lot. Again, they kind of came into power during that Hasmonean rule when and they teamed up with the Hasmoneans, and gained kind of power through that. They were rich, and they essentially controlled the temple. Okay, they controlled the temple, that kind of priesthood, that kind of thing. They did that. They liked the Romans, right? They liked all that stuff. But the reality is, they were corrupt. Okay, they were corrupt, and pretty much everyone knew it. Okay, like everyone knew, and like all the like everyday people and stuff, like they knew these people were corrupt, but there wasn't like a whole lot they could do about it, kind of a thing. Okay, so that's the Sadducees, kind of like this religious group that was, again, kind of the wealthy people who, again, controlled the temple and kind of were corrupt though in kind of all their practices, right? They sold animals, like that's like Jesus overturning the tables and stuff. Like they sold animals for a profit, like overcharged people, did all these things to make money and not because they're serving God and all this stuff. Okay. And then you have the Pharisees, right? Where, again, probably a name familiar to you guys. But what's interesting about the Pharisees is they actually like began, right? Like that party, that sect of the Jews, right? The Pharisees actually began began as a group in order to go against the hypocrisy of the Hasmoneans and the Sadducees. Okay. That essentially, like, the people, again, saw like these people are corrupt. What's going on? Like, and then you have these Pharisees rise up who were essentially trying to call out that hypocrisy. They really tried to study God's word diligently, like, and they wanted to apply it strictly, to their lives. And the reality is, like, everyone loved them, right? Like all the people of the nation loved them, except for, right, the Sadducees, right? Like they didn't like them. Okay. But everyone else loved them, right? Because they're like, yeah, they're calling out those people, right? Like they're living the way you're supposed to, and they're not, right? Like, and so then this is why it's so shocking when Jesus starts calling out some of the Pharisees, right? Because people are like, wait a second, like these are the people we all love. Like, what do you mean? And that's because, right, the reason why Jesus is calling them out is because for some of them, right, not all of them, but some of them, they had taken this devotion to like really be strict in following the law to then that turned into pride, and they prided themselves in the things they did, and they became hypocritical, where they'd say one thing and do another, and even like kind of legalistic, where they made all these rules and kind of equated them to the laws of God, even though they weren't the laws of God, right? And so they kind of ended up going in that path, and that's why Jesus starts calling them out. Okay. But we also see, like in Acts 15, that there are some of the Pharisees who actually did believe in Jesus, right? Like that this party, like a lot of times I think we can go to the extreme of like Pharisees, all bad, all terrible. Who are they? What the heck? Who do they think they are? Right? It's like, no, they're largely like, were pretty like good in the most part, right? Like, I mean, there were a lot that like it started out well, I guess that's what I should say. But the party started out well with good intentions, right? But again, through kind of their desires or like kind of their desire to be strict and following the law and different things and adding different rules and all that, it went down this bad road of kind of, again, being hypocritical, legalistic, all that different stuff, right? And so, but there were some, even in Jesus' time, that were still good, right? Like, and they responded to the gospel. They actually responded well to Jesus and all that, okay? So we often can sometimes think like Pharisees all bad, right? But like some of them were actually like kind of good, okay? But a lot of them still had problems, and that's what Jesus called out, okay? So don't get me wrong. So you have to find that balance, right? Where you can't just say like, yeah, they're all bad, and you can't also say like, oh, the Pharisees are great, they're awesome. It's like, no, they were like, you got to find like kind of in between, right? Like kind of in between of that, where some were pretty good, some not great, right? Like not good, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. All right, next one, scribes, okay? They're generally kind of associated with the Pharisees and all that. They were really like the experts in the law. They knew the Old Testament well. Those people, zealots are mentioned. Those are kind of the political rebels, radicals that opposed Rome, right? Really fighting against Rome. They like the Pharisees. People kind of like them. Again, this ties into one of Jesus' disciples that he calls, right? Simon the Zealot. Okay, which again, if you think of Jesus' group, you have a tax collector on one side, kind of worked for Rome. People didn't like him. Then you have Simon the Zealot, who greatly opposed Rome, and Jesus calls each of them, right? And they're part of this group, right? And you start to see Jesus kind of transcending that, those culture things to bring unity and peace among them, okay? The Herodians, right? Those were kind of the high-class political elite that supported the rule of the Herods, okay? They were wealthy, and they wanted to stay wealthy, right? Like, that's kind of who they are. And as a result, they didn't like the Pharisees and Zealots, right? They didn't like them. Okay, makes sense. And lastly, the average person, like in Jesus' time, right? Kind of the average Jew in this time, right? They were very concerned about their spiritual life. They were concerned about their relationship with God. They had a lot of knowledge of the Old Testament. They really did. And like I mentioned before, like they loved the Pharisees, right? Like they loved the Pharisees, but they didn't necessarily live like them. They didn't live to that extreme, right? But they did love them. And they didn't like Rome and the Roman rule as well. Okay. And so that gives you kind of an idea of the culture at the time. And really, like, why that's kind of important to understand a little bit here is, especially when you have like the Sadducees and Pharisees, kind of combine those, Sadducees and Pharisees, who were like kind of the two main people in power kind of a thing at that time, like the two main things. This is all set up, right? Like God sets up the nation in such a way that you can have the true, genuine Messiah come, and instead of being greeted and welcomed as the Messiah as he should have been, he's what? Killed. And so God positions the nation in such a time, in such a way, with certain people in power, that when Jesus does come, that he would die. Right? Because that's what you have in the Old Testament. You have this Messiah who is going to come, but he's going to die. He's going to pay for the sins of his people, right? Like he's going to die on their behalf. And so you're like, well, how do you get to that, right? How do you have this one that people, well, you have it. You have people who are now, in control, right? You have people in control, the Sadducees and Pharisees, who don't want to lose power. Right? Like they have their power, they want it, and Christ is that threat to that power, and they're not going to let him get in their way, right? And so it's all set up perfectly. So that's why it's kind of good to understand like who these people are, what's going on, right? Because really God has positioned everything at this moment so that this is the perfect time for Christ to come, perfect time for all of this to unfold, and to bring God the most glory, right? And so again, so hopefully this again sets us up well as we start this book of Matthew. Next week we'll actually like get into the book, okay? But for right now, hopefully this gives you a little bit of background of what's going on, and as well as like an understanding of where we're heading, right? Where we're going to really be focusing on Jesus as the King of Israel, the true Messiah, right? Like that's what we're going to be focusing on over the next many months, probably a couple of years, right? Like so, as we study Jesus's life. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a good background of it, and just prepares us for next week where we really get into it. So I'm really excited to get into this with you guys and looking forward to it. All right. So that actually wraps us up. So high schoolers, I'll be sending out the link to our small groups here shortly, and junior hires, I will see you tomorrow. All right. Well, I'll see you guys later.